Today's podcast is brought to you by Chikara Wrestle Factory, 4711 Wingate Street, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, specializing in lucha libre, pura-su, European, British, and German styles, mixed martial arts, and American pro wrestling, all built into the curriculum at the Wrestle Factory, where they strive to create the most well-rounded performers active today. Hey yo, Fro Wrestling Podcast listeners, help us out and click the subscribe button to show us your support. Hello everyone and welcome to this episode of the Fro Wrestling Podcast. This episode we have a very special guest. For those of you who are like diehard fans like myself, if you're students of mine from the past who I know how much you love wrestling, you spend every minute you can seeking out more and more wrestling programs to see, different styles, different promotions and all that. And I've been doing that myself all my life. I've seen everything from old school NWA, AWA, World Class, WWF, and the list goes on. But there were a couple promotions I found when I was younger. They were harder to find where I lived, and I found their programming was just off the charts. I was totally drawn in, and one of those was Smokey Mountain Wrestling, where I got really lucky. I had a friend who moved out from Tennessee, and he had some videotapes of Smokey Mountain, and it just blew my mind. And our guest today just blew me away with his work ethic. He was a member of a really incredible tag team, the Heavenly Bodies. My guest today is the Doctor to Dyer, Dr. Tom Prichard. Welcome to the podcast, Mr. Prichard.
Well, Frederick, thank you for having me on the podcast today. It's always great to be talking to different people from different parts of the country who experience something like Smoky Mountain Wrestling with a little southern flavor, if you will, for the Northeasterners up in the cold and wet, balmy, nasty part of the country, as Jim Cornette would like to describe it. I kind of liked it when I lived up there, though, man. It was cool.
I can't imagine what it was like working with that guy. He's all full of passion.
A lot of fun, yeah.
So I'm really excited to have you with us today because, I mean, I don't know if you noticed or not, but yeah, you have actually a huge following up here. Yeah, Pennsylvania is a huge wrestling area to begin with, and I'm right near Philadelphia. And a lot of us, myself included, we followed your career quite a bit. A lot of the listeners that we have right now are a little younger, and they don't know just how incredible the quality of wrestling was coming out of promotions like that. And so with your experiences, I thought you could really help them get a better understand what some of those contributions were, because really without those kinds of promotions, we wouldn't have what we have today.
Well, I think it's so hard to try to explain in words and even watch on YouTube, because it was a feeling back then when you walked into a Smoky Arena, when you walked into a Coliseum. And when I say a Smoky Arena or Coliseum, people were allowed to smoke back then, and there was a haze over the ring, or there were just ring lights, and the house lights would go down, and the attention was right on the ring. I mean, there was nothing to take the attention away from it. You had to perform, you had to work, you had to tell a story. And it was a different style, it was a different time, it was a different era, obviously. But the stories were a little more, especially when I grew up in the territories I wrestled in, they were a little more intense in the fact that we were trying to sell what we were doing as quote unquote real, that we were really mad at each other, and it was a real contest. But looking back on it, if you really looked at it with any logical eyes and looked at what was going on, you could see that there had to be some cooperation, there had to be something going on in the ring, even though and even though a lot of people thought that and knew that, it was still enjoyable because the guys of that era, myself included, had the passion, the dedication, and the wherewithal to go forth and put everything we had in our craft and go out there and believe what we were doing so everyone else believed what we were doing. And not everybody got it, not everybody believed it and got into it, but you had a lot of people who did. You had people who brought knives to the arena to stab that bad heel, that bad villain. I've been hit with a chair. I've been hit with a cane from people. I've been hit with fists just walking back from the ring. So, I mean, you had enough people back then who believed it, and we had a different style of. It wasn't as showy, even though it was still show business. It wasn't as much then as it is today. So. And let me say this, that today's athletes, today's wrestlers are much better athletes and much better in tune with the culture and pop culture especially. So while I can tell you all about how it was back then, it's really hard to grasp unless you actually experienced it. And back then it was more of an experience going because you had a territory where you would run towns every week, and you would have to change up what you did every week. You couldn't have the same match week after week. You had to be a little bit more creative. It was very impromptu. So that was the biggest difference, I think, between then and now. It was not as rehearsed. It was not as smooth and clean and pristine, if you will. There was a lot more grit, grime, gritty, nasty feel to it, and I kind of like that.
I actually think that makes it feel a little more organic, too, because I know there's some people who've commented on some of the episodes of my podcast that, you see almost the same people every week on some of these shows, and it makes it really tough sometimes to really get into it. But back then, I mean, it really was. Like, you'd turn on a show, and you'd see you guys matched up with totally different people every week, and it was just fresh every time.
Well, I mean, it wasn't. I mean, there was, of course, you had your angles, you had your programs that you did work with the same people a lot of times, but we didn't have writers. We had one booker, maybe two bookers. Maybe you had a booker and an assistant booker. But these days, WWE has at least, the last time I was there and personally saw it, there were 16 writers, but now I believe there's over 25 writers to write all these shows. You have 3 hours on Monday, you have 2 hours on Tuesday, then you have your network content as well. So, I mean, it's a big corporation and it's a big business, and it's just how things have evolved. But it was a much more simpler time back then, and the world was a simpler world back then too. So we're talking, I started watching wrestling in the early 1960s, and I started in 1979, and continued on all the way up until now, where I'm still training people, and you just have to keep up with the times if you want to survive. And not all the time were the territories fresh, and they had their downslides and down periods, if you will, too. But for the most part, if you were going to work in the territory and survive, you had to learn how to draw money and learn how to survive. So these days, there's a lot more riding on your paycheck and riding on business and just getting in the ring and wrestling. It's a lot more involved.
So I wanted to run through some of your background, because a lot of my listeners, they aren't as familiar, because our biggest exposure in this area is pretty much WWE and WCW back when that was around. But as I understand it, you started out in Los Angeles with Mike LaBelle for a time, and I heard you were in a tag team with Brian Adams, who I think some of the fans might remember from Chronic and places like that. Was it Chris Adams? Okay.
Yes. Yep.
How is it working with him? I actually heard he's actually so underrated as a performer.
Well, yeah, first of all, let me just say, I started in Texas in October '79. I got sent to California from Gary Hart in January of 1980. So, yeah, California was my first real full-time territory. But Chris Adams was might have been an underrated performer in some people's eyes, but in Dallas, he and Gino Hernandez were known as the dynamic duo, and they feuded with Von Erich and did very, very well. Chris was a wild man. Chris was he was young and just came over to the States and had Los Angeles, and he and I got along very well because we both had a lot of the same likes and dislikes, and inside and outside the ring. So Chris was underrated to some, but I think others, he got his just due, especially in Texas. He really made a name for himself in Texas. Yeah,
I love those old world-class videos. I think that whole promotion, if they hit it a little differently, we might be all watching WCCW today instead of WWE. But
yeah, you're right. But there were a lot of elements that not just like world-class, like the business back then. So
yeah,
that's why it is a much better business today in some respects, and in other respects, it's not so much.
So then, after you were done there, from what I understand, you moved over to Continental, and that was where things that seemed like really took off. How different were the when the bookers started really pushing you?
Well, I think again, I left California, went back to Texas for a little bit, then went to Atlanta, and then kind of got screwed up various ways before I went to Atlanta, which we all do when we're young. We either take the right path or the wrong path, and I happened to get married to somebody I really didn't love, didn't care about. It was just one of those things. And then I finally, I went to a few different territories before I wound up at Continental. That was about 6 years in. So that was in Continental. It was actually where Brad Armstrong was the brother of the Road Dogg, and his dad, Bullet Bomb Armstrong, is a Hall of Famer, asked me to come into Pensacola and wrestle, and that's where, the wrestling business is a very cliquish business. Any entertainment business, I've got to say, you have your cliques, you have your politics, you have your business. It's the way life works. And I just happened to be in with those people at that time. The Armstrongs were very good friends, were still very good friends, and that's how I got my push. That's how I got my opportunity. But they found out that it was a nice fit for Continental, and I was able to stay there for a few years. So that it happened because the right people were there for me to work with as a heel, and that's where I got my confidence and got my feet under me working as a heel. And
you got an opportunity, I think, there to work with Dennis Condrey, who used to be in the Midnight Express, right?
Yes. I got to work with a lot of guys here. Robert Fuller, Jim Goldman, got to manage them. Johnny Rich, Dennis Condrey, the Armstrongs again, Jerry Stubbs, Rip Rogers, a lot of old school guys that a lot of people probably mainstream haven't heard about, but need to, if they love the business and want to know about it, know who shaped it and helped shape it, even to this day, because Rip Rogers is an excellent teacher. And Danny Davis, one of the nightmares with Ken Wayne, is an excellent teacher, was the head coach in OVW for many years with Jim Cornette, who put out Randy Orton, John Cena, Batista. Gosh, there's a lot of superstars who are still on the roster today. So a lot of the guys from Continental Wrestling, they made a change and made a difference in the business.
And then when you moved on from there, I know at least for a little while, you were in USWA, and I know you had something going on with Eric Embry, but I don't know if the fans realize you got to work with Stone Cold long before he was Stone Cold, and then I think you had Tojo Yamamoto was your manager in a stable there. How was that working with a young guy who obviously had a lot of talent, but I don't think anybody really knew how big he was going to be?
No, yeah, Steve was just breaking in, and Steve was a heel too, and riding with me in the Dallas territory. Well, it's mainly Tennessee territory. We just worked Dallas on Friday night. But Steve and I lived at a place called the Congress Inn in Nashville, Tennessee, which was a real dump. But it had charm. If you didn't have a gun, they gave you one when you checked in, things like that. Steve was a sponge. Steve wanted to learn. Steve loved the business. Steve was just getting his feet wet. It was interesting riding with him because he knew he wasn't stunning Steve Austin. He knew there had to be something else, and he was looking for it. So actually asked him one time, tell me about this. What is stunning Steve? You're wearing red robe. You're coming out in white boots and biker trunks. This long, stringy blonde hair, it just didn't fit. Stunning Steve didn't fit. But when he shaved his head and grew a mustache and goatee, he was Stone Cold. Even though Jeannie, his wife, came up with the Stone Cold moniker, it definitely fit Steve. He just had that attitude. And I think, once again, that was an evolution, and that was something that happened over time. He couldn't just come into the business and be Stone Cold. He had to have some scars. He had to get knocked around a little bit, and that's how he became that real persona that he is. He wasn't playing a part. He wasn't pretending to be Stone Cold Steve Austin. He was Stone Cold Steve Austin. And
I think some fans may not realize, I actually ran into him at the Marriott Hotel in Philly one time. One of the nicest people in the world, though. I mean, he took time for everybody, and just such a gracious guy. It was really impressive.
Well, I think that, again, goes back to his roots. It goes back to a guy who understands how he got his success, how hard he fought for it. He understood the road he took, and he understood the people he met on that road. Some were nice, some weren't so nice. And if you're going to be that successful, you do know you have to take care of yourself, and you're going to have to fight for everything you get. But I think he also appreciates people who appreciated him and were gracious and grateful back. In order to get respect, you have to give respect, and Steve knows that very well. So if it's a fan or just someone who happens to know who he is and wants to be respectful in saying hello, Steve will reciprocate. He's the same guy he always was. He's just a lot more successful than Richard.